The Democrats do not have the votes to pass their Voting Rights Act. This is the terrible piece of legislation that would federalize elections and really overturn all the voter integrity laws that have been passed in so many different states. The Democrats are desperate to do this. And but to do it, they have to overcome the filibuster. Well, it's not even clear that they have the 51 votes, but they certainly don't have 60. And so they are simultaneously pushing the voting rights bill, and at the same time they're railing on the filibuster, and they're trying to make life miserable for Sinema and Manchin. And they're going through this kind of theater, which seems to have a known outcome. But nevertheless, they're pushing it through anyway. I think they feel like if we can get Manchin on the record, we can get Sinema on the record, this will somehow maybe pressure them to change their mind. Now, Joe Biden, who's a pawn of this whole operation, recently tweeted, and I'm going to put this up on the screen so you can take a look while I'm reading it to you. His favorite phrase these days is Jim Crow 2.0. Jim Crow 2.0. He goes, Jim Crow 2.0 is about two insidious things. Let's see what they are. Voter suppression, and election subversion. He goes, it's about making it harder to vote and who gets to count the vote and whether your vote counts at all. Now, this is really over-the-top rhetoric because, well, I mean, you would think that somebody making these kinds of claims would be able to produce a long procession of people who have been trying to vote but have been unable to vote, voter suppression. Then he goes on, it's about who gets to count the vote, as if election integrity bills are somehow creating Republican counting teams that can somehow rig the vote, and whether your vote counts at all, as if you've now got a committee that's throwing out votes into the trash. I mean, this is beyond the pale. And even the equation to Jim Crow obviously raises the question, what was Jim Crow? Well, who was Jim Crow? People use that phrase, Jim Crow. But who was Jim Crow? Well, Jim Crow was a kind of persona, a character, both in writing as well as in the theater. It was primarily developed by a guy named Thomas Rice in the early 19th century. It was a kind of stereotypical and to today's sensibility, very offensive, cartoonish portrait of African Americans and of black culture. It was based upon a kind of folk trickster named Jim Crow that was apparently popular in the kind of folk tales that were around slavery. But this idea, which was a negative depiction of blacks, came to symbolize laws that were passed starting in the late 19th century, continuing in the 20th century, and these were called the Jim Crow laws. And essentially what they meant is they separated blacks and whites into two independent worlds. Now, this is not to say that blacks and whites didn't interact at all. They did, but they interacted only in very controlled settings. You might have, for example, a black maid cleaning the home of a white family. But by and large, if you were a black guy and you wanted a haircut, you had to go to a black barber. At least this was in states that had Jim Crow or segregation laws. Black businesses were separated from white businesses. You had, for example, in Durham, North Carolina, white banks and black banks. Blacks and whites went to different schools in segregated cities and segregated states, and so they didn't attend school together. And so this isolation of one race from the other, somewhat a kind of American version of apartheid, you'd have to say, well, all of this is utterly removed from anything that Biden is talking about now, because obviously no one is talking, no one's even considering any return to that kind of racial separation. Now, it is true that in Jim Crow days, in the days of segregation, the Democratic Party, and only the Democratic Party, systematically practiced voter suppression. Their techniques were things like the poll tax, so you have to pay money to vote. And the idea here was to disenfranchise people who essentially had no money or couldn't afford to. So this was a kind of open way of isolating, only you guys can vote and you guys can't vote. Again, there's no resemblance to anything going on now. And The other technique of voter suppression was the Ku Klux Klan. It wasn't just that the Klan would randomly perpetrate violence against blacks, but they would stand. You'd have all these Klan guys who would come to the polls and look to see which black guys show up. And it's like, listen, we're going to be paying you a visit later. You're going to really regret you showed up for the polls. Of course, the fear on the part of the Klan was that these blacks were going to be voting, as they typically did, Republican. So this is the actual history of voter suppression. So think of the irony of Biden, who's himself palled around with segregationists. He was a friend of Robert Byrd. He was a friend of a lot of the racist, worst racists in the Democratic Party. And this guy is lecturing us about Jim Crow. When you turn to the voter integrity laws, what you find out is that the provisions in the voter integrity laws in states like Georgia are only trying to implement now things that already exist in Democratic states. And so, for example, right now, even with voter integrity laws, it's easier to vote in Georgia than it is, for example, in New York. And yet, you never hear Democrats calling New York a racist state. It seems that only when Republicans pass laws to protect the vote, then suddenly it becomes racism, whereas if the exact same laws exist in Delaware or New Jersey or New York, no problem. We're not even going to mention that, pretend that no one notices, count on the media to kind of play the same fiddle, play the same tune that we are playing. And here's Amy Klobuchar basically talking about why the filibuster needs to end. She goes, democracies around the world do not use the 60-vote threshold. As if to say that because the filibuster is American, it's not used by other democracies. It's sort of, we don't really need it. It's not a necessary concomitant to democracy. Well, okay, but many democracies around the world have no protection for free speech. Many democracies around the world don't protect civil rights. They elevate one tribe, the majority tribe, over the minority tribe, the Hutu over the Tutsi, or the other way around. Some democracies, Great Britain is a good example, coexist with a monarchy. Other democracies in the Muslim world, Pakistan's a good example, use majority rule to impose Sharia law. So this idea that sort of democracies around the world don't do it the way we do is not exactly doesn't make the point that Klobuchar is trying to make, that somehow they become exemplary and we should follow their model. Not at all. America has struck a balance between majority rule and the protection of minority rights. Yes, the majority gets to rule, but within a certain limited domain, with rights for the minority, including people who live in states that didn't vote for Joe Biden. So all of this, I think, is being obscured, if not lost, in this debate. I think the good news is that even though we're hearing a lot of nonsense in the debate, as far as we can tell now, is going to have a satisfactory outcome.